Hello everyone and welcome again to another webinar. So my name's Nick Trevor and I'll be taking this webinar on printing hacks. So let's get stuck straight in. So today I want to concentrate on some of the printing options that are available to you within SYSPRO and some of the setup considerations that you need to take when utilising these options. So many of you will be aware of the three options that are available to you within SYSPRO 7 and 8. 6.1, and I said prior to 7 will be slightly different, but essentially the three options are client side using XML, server side using SQL, or client side using SQL. The server side and the client side being the two key methods of printing. So in terms of availability, as I mentioned, there's a small little graph in front of you that will show you what options are available to you. In Avanti and Espresso being web applications, they rely solely on server-side printing being used within SYSPRO. So you must toggle that on if you are planning to print from either of those applications. So client-side using XML essentially will bind the report to the XML on the client machine. So a lot more processing of the printing itself is done within the client. That relies mainly on having both Java and Crystal runtimes installed on the clients, which can obviously add an overhead to your IT and setups. Client-side using SQL is very similar, apart from the fact that it uses SQL to bind the report, which should make it slightly quicker. So they introduced this in 7 to improve some of the performance of reporting. So if you're on 7, it'll always be a good idea to toggle that on, but bear in mind that there are it affects pretty much every report, and you'll notice at the very top when you run a report, it'll either say XML or it won't, and that means it'll be using SQL instead. But that should overall improve some performance when using Crystal. Okay, and last but not least is server side, which has been a bit of a curse word throughout the years, but this is really taken, the uptake is getting a lot more higher on this now because of the prevalence with it being only available in Avanti. So there's been a lot more concentration and development into server side to make it richer and better for usability. So essentially this will completely render the report on the server, which means you don't have to install a Crystal client on the client itself. So everything is done on the server, which should kind of centralize the reporting capability of SYSPRO. It also relies on SMTP for emailing. So it doesn't use Outlook like client-side printing does. It uses the SMTP settings high level, which means basically you will be sending your emails to one email address rather than multiple. So a little graph on the architecture that you might have seen before. It uses a report queue. Reports will be added to the queue, processed, and then they will become available to the users to access. Same with documents. So if you're sending an invoice, that will go into a document queue, and then processing will be done from there. The difference with documents is you can actually, if you've got document preview on, it will then preview the report and render it straight away. While with reports, it'll always go through the queuing system. But hold that thought for a second. Okay, I just want to show you, I put a little video together to show you the difference in speed on the client versus server side and client side printing. So on the left, I'm running an invoice reprint for 6 invoices, which will be sending, I think 5 emails and printing 1. And on the right, it's doing exactly the same, but through the client side printing. So I'm going to play the video and talk you through it because it should hopefully show you what I mean in terms of speed enhancements. So the left has basically posted all the information to the queuing service, which means it's done in literal seconds. And on the right, I'm still processing the invoices, because what this is doing, it's calling each individual invoice, it's calling the print function or the email function, depending on what it's doing, and going through it individually. So it takes a lot longer because all the processing is happening on the client, which means server side in the background, the client's free to go off and do what they want, but in the background, it's sending or printing the invoice. So it might actually take the same amount of time to print, but in terms of the client speed, the performance is, pretty huge. So you can see, you're talking a whole 90% improvement in terms of the client. In SYSPRO 8 2020 R1, they actually enhanced server-side printing to allow you to preview the report instantly. That was to mimic what client-side did and a lot of what people weren't happy with. So that's only available in Avanti currently, and I'll show you that. With hopefully the expectation that will drive into the client as well. Also, with server-side, they've enabled archiving, exporting to additional formats, and if you use custom crystal reports, you can now process crystal reports with parameters in Avanti as well. And finally, by toggling server-side printing on, that gives, if you've got developers in-house, the ability to use the Open Reporting API, which allows external applications to actually call crystal reports or documents such as invoices from an external application, not just SYSPRO alone, because that is what things like Espresso rely on to generate documents. So that can all, take away a bit of a headache from developers, because they don't need to worry about calculating tax values, for instance, within SSRS. They can instead use the reporting API to generate documents. Okay, so I want to show you a little bit of what about reporting looks like inside Avanti. So I'm just going to wake up my Avanti because it goes to sleep if I've left it a bit too long. Okay, so essentially I've got my reporting services on the left. I've got a custom report which I created, which is a stock label. It allows me to enter parameters and generates a very, very basic label for my stock code. So I can click onto that. Now, first you'll notice these parameters are actually built within the crystal report. So that's what I was talking about when it allows Avanti now has the capability to render the parameters based on the crystal report. So all that functionality is now, enabled. So I can select my stock code from a list. I can select my warehouse. And you'll notice up here inside of Avanti, I have my add to print queue, which is what we were previously used to, where the report would go into the queue, it would poll for 20, 30 seconds, and then it'll become available to the user via a notification. But now they've also added the process report and preview option. What that will do, it will actually call the report instantly rather than poll, and that means the report is instantly available to me, which then renders the PDF as I want. Also within that, as I mentioned, you've got the export options in the output tab here. So you can actually get it to export into various formats within Avanti. Okay, I want to talk a little about format options inside SYSPRO, because these are quite commonly overlooked. Normally people set it up and save without actually considering the formats in front of them. So when I set up a new document template inside SYSPRO, there are various other options, and I will just show you this briefly. So one thing to notice, they've introduced something called use the SQL driver for documents. This should actually improve performance of your reporting, but once ticked on, I think this became available about SYSPRO 7 midway through. So if you're on 8, you'll definitely have it, but do check. Once that's ticked on, like I say, it'll improve performance, but you might just need to consider some of the formulas within your report because blanks and null checks are slightly different. Optimizing the print can actually basically will print the report as soon as the data is available to it. When that's checked, though, it does actually mean that some of the options below, such as the email options or printing options as a single document, aren't available. But what it should do is improve performance, because as soon as that data is ready, it'll print it. So if you're doing a batch of 200, it doesn't need to wait for 200 invoices to be ready before it starts printing. It'll just print it instantly. So that can greatly improve performance on printing. The default Windows PDF viewer means I can open reports using Adobe or Chrome rather than the Crystal viewer. Archiving, I'm going to talk about a bit later because it's very useful within SYSPRO. But essentially, to turn archiving on against the report, I must select it here and then select the archive type. I can either choose an RPT file, which is what Crystal is used to running, or a PDF, or both for my archiving. There's a few printer options in terms of spooling. So if you want rather spool it as an entire batch rather than individuals, you can do. And also, if you're not using anything like Automail and you're relying on SYSPRO to do the emailing, you can actually set up options here to group it by email address, etc. The printers on the right allows me to actually print multiple copies, or I can even print another copy to a separate printer. So just by adding it to that list, which means it's quite useful. So if you do have, you might have a hardware printer which prints the physical copy, but you might have a software printer like Ghost PDF, which will print it and store it to a location, or send it to SharePoint, for instance. Okay, very quick now, I'll just show you how to get to these format options. So within the SYSPRO client, I go to set up stationary formats, and I'm just going to click on, let's say, my sales order documents. And for my invoice, select on my SRS options, change. And once I click on that, it will then bring up my format options here. So that's where they are accessed from. Now I can, if you don't know, you might not have all these options as standard, but if you right click and show captions, it might be available in that hidden window. Okay. So very simple, very quick. Okay, archiving. So this is a very useful tip for you all inside SYSPRO because it's not typically taken up actually. People use Automail perhaps to do this task, which I've done in the past, but SYSPRO also have its own archiving features both for reports and documents. So to set that up, you go to the SRS document setup folder in the program file, and then you can set the archive root folder. So where do you want to actually store these documents? You can store it in the standard one or a user-defined folder. Then within that folder, it'll create an archive folder for each company, and then for each type of document, etc. Then on the left-hand side, I can use my archive viewers to view any archived documents. Before I do set up a document for archiving, once you click on the viewer, it will then do it will create basically an archive table within SQL for you. So you must do that first before you start archiving documents. And they'll be called SRS archive, and then with a suffix such as INV for invoice. And then from there, you can see each document that's been archived and where it lives within your root storage. Document types then. Obviously, a document type is something like an invoice, or an order acknowledgement, or a purchase order. There's various amounts of them in SYSPRO, but what is quite important is you can actually, against these document types, you can change some settings to do with archiving. So within the stationary format and SRS document setup, my document types on the left, I can use the toolbox to change. And you'll notice here on my SRS document type at the bottom, I can actually archive fields to the right-hand side. So what that means is when I'm searching for an archived document, I can actually search by custom form fields or customer code or customer purchase order, for instance, and I'll show you a little bit what that actually means to you. Okay. Reports can also be archived. So if you ever run an inventory valuation, that can also be set up to be archived. And that's done within the SYSPRO reporting services folder. The setup options, you can set it to always archive the report. And what that means is any report that is then printed becomes available within the report archive. So from there, I can then actually preview the report and see it again, or I can even see what operators are running what reports, which might be useful to see what kind of reports are being used within the business. Okay, so let's have a little look at what archiving actually means. So if I go into SRS documents, you'll see I've got my document set up here, and that's where I access where I can set it up to point to my particular folders. And then I've got my archive viewers down here, which allows me to view them. So what I'm first going to do, I'm actually going to demo this by running an invoices through. So I'm going to just go to my document print program, and I'm going to just untick that for now and print. Okay, so this is using server-side printing. So as I say, the screen's now available to me instantly. I can go to my SRS documents and look at the queue to see the progress of these particular reports. You can see in queue and what the action is, whether it's send or print or necessarily preview. So once those are run through, so they're processing, and then essentially you will then see that they get an archiving status. So this is what happened inside server side. Everything is happening in the background, which means the client is all freed up from resource. Okay, so I will quickly move on. So once I go to my archive, so I look at my sales order invoice archive down here, I can see various. So these are for my test previously. And if you notice there, that's my first one that's come through that's been archived. And when I was talking about document types and the fields you can archive, these are all the ones I selected. So before I didn't have those selected in my previous archive. Once I selected them on, it started storing information about the invoice, the dispatch note, the sales order, to allow me to use the searches within here to find the document itself, which means I can come into the archive, hit preview, and bring it back up into a preview screen at any point in time. If I go into something like my customer query to look at the invoice, so I tap from that, my invoices come up. Using the hyperlink, I can actually access my archived invoices. Not sure what happened there, but essentially that'll bring the archive program, and I can then preview the invoices for 100610. Okay, so really quite handy. Another key thing is scheduling reports, okay? So using server side, it's actually a bit simpler because all the scheduling is done on the server. To do that with client side, you have to log on to the server, run the SYSPRO client, and go from there. If you do it with server side, no matter which client you run, the schedule will always be published on the server, which means it's always, your computer's always running and will always be able to access the schedule to be able to publish the report to you. So within SYSPRO reporting services, I can go in, I can click the add, and I can set a time or date to run a report. So if I've got long running reports like an inventory valuation that could take 3 minutes, and I don't want to run that in the day, I can set that to send it to or email it to my user in the morning using the SYSPRO report scheduler, which is quite a useful feature to making reports run quicker. One little tip, if you're not using server side and you are using client side, there is a little checkbox in system-wide personalization, which might be useful to select on. It's called basically optimized by preloading the crystal runtimes. If that is selected, then when the client loads, it will also load the crystal runtimes in the background. So when the first print that you run will be as quick as any subsequent prints after that. It will increase the kind of the RAM usage on the client though initially, but it won't slow down the load. And for today, that is all I wanted to show you. I will be doing a second session on this where I'll go a bit more deeper into some of the crystal tricks and tips that you can do to get better use of your printing. If you have any questions, please add them to the poll, and I hope this has been useful to you.